Thanks to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video. For more information, check the affiliate link in the description. I've always been a huge fan of strategy card games. Ever since we were kids, me and my brother, we used to play the legendary card game Yu-Gi-Oh!
Exodia! Obliterate!
And then later I got into Hearthstone, then Magic the Gathering. So I decided to make a tutorial dedicated to 3D cards that are completely customizable and very easy to make changes to. First, we'll go over how to design the front and back side of the card based on reference images. At first, I did try to come up with the card design on pen and paper, but ultimately threw it in the trash and decided to use reference from the Duelist game, seeing as the style in that game is more minimalistic and clean, so that would make things more straightforward for the sake of the tutorial. But remember, the card design can be anything you want it to be. The main goal is to make sure we're working with 3D layers so we're able to push and pull elements in Z space so we get parallax as we rotate the card or the camera. We will also take a look at how we can use an expression for a dynamic anchor point to make sure the letters are always centered vertically. Shout out to Jeff Knight from 7-Minute Tutorials for sharing this tip. Once we have the front and back side of our card, we will then combine them, link all the elements to one single 3D null parent for easy control, and use some more expressions to make sure the front side of the card is visible when facing the camera and invisible when facing away from the camera, and vice versa for the back side of the card. I also have to give a shout out to Ukra Media for sharing this wonderful expression on their video about 60 After Effects tips. Links to the mentioned videos will be provided in the description or by clicking the top cards above. Finally, we'll spice things up by setting up a scene with a cool background, a light in order to cast some shadows onto a ground layer, a light sweep on the card itself, some glow effects, and even reflections on the card by grabbing an HDRI image from a free website like polyhaven.com and using the CC environment effect to give the card a more premium look. Then we'll take a look at how we can use the essential graphics tools for very fast and easy adjustments on our card elements. The project files are available on my Gumroad page along with previous projects, which as always are using the pay what you want system, so you can grab anything you want for free. But of course, any donations would be much appreciated. Let me know in the comments section if you've ever played any strategy card games and what your favorite one is. I then challenge you to make a 3D card based on that game by using what you learn in this tutorial, and if you happen to post it on social media platforms, then make sure to also tag me. With that said, it's time to Alright, so here we are now in After Effects, and as you can see I have the original project open just in case we need to refer back to any of the original materials later on. But let's go ahead and close one of the comps here by hitting Ctrl W, or we could use Ctrl Alt W to close all of the open comps all at once. Now let's go ahead and create a new composition by going over to Composition, New Composition, rename this to Card Front, let's set it to 1920 by 1080 for now. Leave it at 30 frames per second, 10 seconds long, and hit OK. Now when it comes to creating shapes in After Effects, we could either use solids or shape layers. The main difference being that shape layers are vector based and they have a bunch more customizability. In fact, let me go ahead and create a new solid real quick and I'll give you a quick example. So we have this card here and let's say we want to give this round corners. So we could say go over to the rectangle tool and then left click and hold down the mouse button, go over to the rounded rectangle tool. You can also hit Q to toggle between the different shapes, and then with the layer selected you can double click on it and that will create perfect rounded corners. Now what if we wanted to increase the size of these rounded corners? Well, we can't quite do that. We would have to somehow manually adjust these points, and even then we wouldn't be able to make them perfect. Another way would be to say let's delete this and select the rectangle tool one more time and then click and drag here roughly, and then as you hold down on the left mouse button you can use the scroll wheel to increase or decrease the size of these rounded corners. But again, as soon as we let go, we now can't go back and make adjustments to that. So let's hit delete quickly to delete that, and let's instead use shape layers. Before we do anything though, with the composition selected, we can go over to composition settings, and we'll set the width to 500 and the height to 700, since those are the dimensions we're going to use for our card. Now let's hit OK, and just make sure we click on our composition here and just double click on the rounded rectangle tool. Now we can go down to the contents of our rectangle path. We can adjust the roundness size of our layer, which is very convenient compared to the destructive way of doing things with solids. So let's set the roundness to 20. Then we can disable the stroke. We can set the color to something like a bluish here, and I have a hex code saved on a notepad on my second monitor, so we'll copy and paste that, hit OK. By the way, I have a bunch of values and color codes written out on my notepad, just so we can keep things moving a bit faster. Now, at the intro of the video, I did mention that I used a reference image, which was this front card from the game Duelist, which did help me a lot in getting a head start with a design, but then moving on, I just went ahead and made adjustments to my liking. But I quickly wanted to remind you that using reference images is always the best way to go because you're not doing any guesswork. Going back to our rectangle path, let's say we want to adjust the points of our corners here. Well, as it is now, we can't make adjustments to the points individually. In order to do that, we would have to convert this to a Bezier path, which would be the same as using masks on our solid. And to do that, let's duplicate this rectangle path so we can disable the original and keep it as a backup. And then under the rectangle path, right click on it, convert to Bezier path. We can toggle the mask path visibilities, so we get these points and we can now adjust them to whatever shape we want. But do keep in mind that this basically makes it destructible, so now we don't have the roundness control or anything like that. But I did want to show you that real quick because it's important to know that this option exists. So let's delete it, turn the original rectangle path back on, and we'll rename this to card base by hitting return on it. And then we'll hit Ctrl-Shift-C to pre-compose it, or you can go over to layer, pre-compose, and call this card base dot. Hit OK. And you'll see why this is very important later down the line. Now we'll go back into the comp real quick, select it, hit Ctrl-C to copy it, and then go back, Ctrl-V to paste, so we have the exact same copy again. And for this, we're going to create an outline stroke. Now, instead of going down to the contents here, we actually have a shortcut menu here at the top, which we can use to set the fill color, the stroke color, and the stroke width. Now, I do want this to not have a fill at all, so we can alt-click on it, and you can see we have a menu that pops up here that says alt-click to cycle through fill type options. So now we have a gradient color, alt-click one more time, we have a radial gradient, and then one last time, and we end up with this diagonal red line, which means we have no fill at all. And then alt-click on the stroke to get a colored stroke, and then we'll set the stroke width to 2 pixels. Now when we go down to the contents, you can see the gradient fill has been shut off, and in fact we can select it and delete it because we don't need it at all. Now we do want to adjust the scale of this, so it's a bit inwards like that, but we don't want to grab it like this, because now what we're doing is just, if we hit S and adjust this, we're actually adjusting the scale of the layer. And that's not good because let's say we squish it a bit horizontally like that. You can see the vertical lines are a bit thinner compared to the horizontal lines at the top. So let's Ctrl-Z to undo. And instead, we'll go over to the contents. Under rectangle, rectangle path, we'll adjust the size. I do have the values written out on a notepad there. So it's 485 by 679. And by adjusting the size value instead of the scale, it makes sure that we keep the thickness consistency across the entire stroke. Now let's duplicate this and call it description outline. It's always good to duplicate whatever existing layers you have instead of creating them from scratch. It just saves you a bit of time. Now under the rectangle path for this, let's adjust the size to 460 by 160. We'll set the roundness back to 10 and then hit P to bring up the position, and we'll just set the Y value to 598. Now I do want to point this out one last time because it is very important. The card design is completely up to you. What I'm doing right now is not something that you should follow step by step in order to get it right. So just keep that in mind moving forward. You can have the card design be whatever you want. Now let's duplicate this and call it image outline, which is going to be the outline that contains our image at the top here. Bring down the contents again. Let's set the size to 460 by 400 and then select it, hit P to bring up the position, and let's just set the Y value to 226. Now let's quickly bring up the reference image, and you can see we have these circles that represent the attack and the defense, or the health, I guess. So let's go ahead and create those. We'll disable it for a moment, and we'll go over to the shape at the top here, click and hold on it, and then select the ellipse tool, and then double click to create an ellipse based on the comp settings. But of course we want a perfect circle, so let's go down under the ellipse path, let's unlink them, and we'll set the size to 100 by 100. Let's disable the stroke for now and enable the fill. And then for the color, I have this hex code right here. Let's also hold down Shift and hit P to bring up the position while also keeping everything else visible. And we'll set the position to 108 by 440. Now, if we turn back the reference image real quick, you see that the outline circle has this sort of gradient color. So at the bottom, it's a bit more yellowish, and then at the top, it becomes a lot brighter. And shape layers actually allow us to do that. Let's quickly rename this to attack circle. And then with it selected over here at the top where it says stroke, we can alt click on it. So we have a filled in stroke, and then we have a gradient stroke. And it's a bit hard to see now, but if we zoom in, you can see that it's red here, and then over here at the right, it's white. And we can actually control the direction of this by using this point. But let's go down and do it in a bit of a more precise way. Under the gradient stroke, we'll set the endpoint to 0 by -50. So it starts at the center here and ends all the way at the top, which is similar to what we have in the reference image. Then let's set the stroke width to 6 to make that a bit thicker so it matches up there. And finally, edit the gradient to adjust the colors. So I'll just paste the color that I have saved up here and hit OK. Then we can do the same thing for the health circle. So we'll Control D to duplicate or edit duplicate, hit return to rename it to health circle. And then with it selected, you can actually go ahead and type in position to search for the position value real quick instead of having to drop down all of the menus. And down here where it says transform position, we'll set it to 392 so it goes all the way to the other side. The only other thing we have to do here is change the color of the gradient. So edit gradient and then copy and paste the hex code. And now that we have the shapes pretty much set up, let's go ahead and start adding the text layers. So we'll select the text tool, click somewhere on the comp to create a text, and we'll type in, say, 0. And the font I'm using is Poppins, which is the font I use for my channel. Let's go over to the paragraph and make sure it's center aligned. Then in order to center the anchor point to the layer itself, we can hit Control Alt Home. And then to center this to the middle of the circle, we can select the circle, hit P, select the position, Control C to copy, and then Control V to paste. And that should jump right inside of that circle. Now we can hit S, maybe scale it down a bit to say 60 or so. And also change the color of the text to this bright orange. Then let's do the same. So Control D to duplicate the number, select the health circle, hit P, copy the position and paste it over here. Then change the color for that as well. And now just to make this a bit more powerful, we'll say 10 attack and 5 health. And just to go back a bit, the reason why I used 0 at the start to center this to the circle is because the 0 number with this font, for example, is perfectly symmetrical. So copying the position from the circle and pasting it to the number is going to make sure it's perfectly at the center of the circle. Now let's go ahead and duplicate one of these numbers in order to create the type of our card. And in fact, we can use the align tools to align it horizontally. And let's double click on it and say dragon. We can also change the thickness of our font to say regular, and then hit S, scale it down to 25. Let's just shut off the reference image, and we can scale this up until we can hit the top and bottom lines here, and then Control Alt Home to make sure the anchor point is sitting right at the center of this layer, and then we'll set the scale back to 25, and this just ensures that this layer is sitting right in the middle of both of these outlines. Let's also change the color of this. Moving on, we can duplicate this, bring it down. This will be our description text. Double click on that and then paste whatever I had in the original example, which is this monster can attack from both the sky and ground. Be careful, boys. Anyway, this one is actually going to be a bit more specific because what we need to do is make sure that whenever we make changes to this, so let's say remove one of the rows, you can see it's leaving a gap at the bottom here, which could be what you want, but in our case, what we want to do is make sure that this is perfectly centered inside of this description outline. First of all, let's start by Control Alt Home and centering the anchor point to the layer itself, and then we can select the description outline, hit P to bring up the position, and copy its position and paste it to the layer. Now what we're going to do is hit A to bring up the anchor point, and we're going to add an expression to this so that the anchor point adjusts based on what we type in the text. So let's alt click on the anchor point to add an expression. And again, I have it saved at the notepad here. So let's Control C and Control V to paste that. We can click and drag here to make a bit more space. And basically this is the expression. But I do have to give a shout out to Jeff Knight from the 7-Minute Tutorials channel, which made a tutorial for this exact technique. So do check it out. Link will be in the description. Essentially what this is doing is calculating the bounding box of our layer and making adjustments to the anchor point to make sure that the anchor point jumps to the middle of that bounding box at all times. So if we click and let go, we can see that nothing has happened. But let's say we double click on it and remove one of the rows. you can see that the anchor point is still at the center of our layer, in turn making sure that the layer is sitting right at the center of the description outline. Pretty cool, pretty neat. Again, you don't even need to understand this. Just copy and paste this and you're good to go. Next up, let's go ahead and duplicate the type text here so we can create the name. We'll bring this up a bit and then we'll double click on it and say, let's type in Shenron, which is the name of the dragon from Dragon Ball Z, which appears whenever you gather the 7 Dragon Balls. And Goku should know about this because he was resurrected like 50 times or something like that. We'll set the thickness of this font to bold, hit S, bring up the scale, and then set this to say 50. Now, before we touch the position of this, let's go ahead and hit A to bring up the anchor point for this as well. And we're actually going to use the same expression that we use for the description text with just a little bit of tweaking. So let's Alt-click, hit Ctrl-V to paste, make some room here. And the only thing we need to do is remove this divided by 2 right after T plus H. And this ensures that the anchor point is sitting right at the center bottom of our text instead. And this way, let's double click on it. Let's say our name has 2 rows, so Shenron something. Oops, that's a mess. It's gonna make sure that the anchor point is sitting at the bottom and the rows are gonna be pushing up. Now we do need to maybe decrease the gap to say 100 or so. And then hit P, let's just adjust the position to something like 373, I'm guessing. I'm not guessing really, I'm just typing in what I'm seeing at the side of my screen. And let's double click, remove the second row, and there you go. Expressions can sometimes be a bit intimidating, but most times you don't even have to understand them. Just look up a tutorial, maybe go into a forum or something, copy an expression and apply it to your project, and then move on with your life. Now that we have all our text layers ready, we could take a look at the essential graphics tools, but I do want to leave that for all the way at the end because it will make more sense. And you'll see just how powerful the essential graphics tools can be in cases like this. Anyway, let's go ahead and finally start creating our image, which will sit right inside of this box. The image is one of the most important parts of the card, so just make sure you spend some extra time to really dial it in. However, I am going to cheat a bit and just use this dragon image reference, drag it over. And for the original project, what I did was just traced over this dragon and over these mountains by using the pen tool and even copied the colors. Now, if that wasn't enough of a cheat, what I'm gonna do is disable this and then go back to the card front original comp. I have this card image pre-comp, which we're going to be setting up in a moment. Click on the dragon layer, hold down shift, click on the mountain 4 layer, hit Ctrl-C to copy, go back to our tut comp and hit Ctrl-V to paste. And then real quick, we'll shut off the 3D switch there so they're back to 2D layers, and we'll even shut them off for now. Now for the next step, which is going to be repositioning our layers in Z space to give our card some depth. Let's go ahead and right click on the comp one more time. We'll go back to composition settings. And let's say set this back to 1920 by 1080, just so we have more viewing space. And then once we're set up and ready to go, we can go back to our original card dimensions. Let's select all of them and then deselect the front card and the dragon image reference and make sure we turn them all into 3D. Now we can go ahead and create a new camera. So layer new camera, maybe 35 millimeters. Now we can hit C to bring up the orbit tool. And then click and hold on it and just make sure we're using the orbit around camera point of interest. That way we're gonna orbit around the point of interest of our camera, which is sitting right at the center of our card. Now let's go over to half view for a bit more speed and then orbit just a little bit so we can see some depth. And then we'll start shifting these in position. So we'll select the name, hit P. And again, I do have the values written out here. So we'll set the name to 30 Z space, which goes inside of the card, which right now we are not able to see unless we go around the back here. But to fix that, what we can do is select the image outline, hit Ctrl-D to duplicate, bring it right above the card base tut here. We'll rename this to image matte. Then we'll go down to the contents. We'll delete the stroke and then add a fill, which doesn't really matter what color it is because we're gonna be using this as an alpha matte. And to toggle the switches here, you can hit F4 and set the card base tut to alpha invert the image matte, which is gonna cut a hole inside of our card base tut. And this way we can see the name text. Now let's select all of these other layers, hit P to bring up the position for all of them. We'll set the type to -15, attack to -10, description to -10 as well. And then we'll set both the attack circle and the health circle to -10. Oops, I forgot to set the health to -15 as well. Sorry about that. Now when we orbit around, there's some parallax to our 3D card due to the position of all of these layers in Z space. By the way, another quick tip is if you hold down Alt, this will allow you to use all 3 camera tools by using the left click as orbit, middle click as pan around the scene, and then right click to dolly in and out. Now let's also bring back the dragon layers here, hit P to bring up the position, and we can go ahead and adjust the Z values. So for the dragon, I set it to 60. But there is a slight problem, and that is we need to make sure we isolate the image layers inside of the contours of our image matte. So let's first make sure that all of these image layers are treated as one layer. And to do that, we need to pre-comp them. But even before that, let's just duplicate the camera so we have a copy of the camera inside our pre-comp, and also go down a bit, and we're going to duplicate the card base and image matte, bring them over here at the top, select all of these, and then hit layer, pre-compose, and we'll call this card image tut. Hit OK. Now, as soon as we pre-compose them, what's going to happen is if we orbit around the scene, you're going to notice that the image layers are not reacting to the camera. And that's because we've lost the 3D capabilities of the layers inside of the comp. Now, if we go inside, they are still 3D, but currently they're not being treated as 3D back in the card front comp. To fix that, we hit F4 to toggle the switches and just make sure we collapse the transformations and turn this back to 3D. Now we can go back to the card image tut real quick and just make sure that we right click on this and set this to a guide layer. And the reason we brought a copy of this in is because I want to put this right on top here, select the camera, and then hit right click, transform, reset. And let's also go to composition settings. We'll set this back to 500 by 700. Same goes for the card front tut. While we're here, we'll also grab the dragon image reference, hit Ctrl X to cut it from this comp, and then paste it back here so we have it where it should be. And now we have contained all the layers of our card image inside of one comp, which is very neat and clean because in the future we can actually go back inside of this comp and make changes to this. But the main reason we did this is so that when we go back to the card front tut, let's Ctrl A to select all and collapse them. We can bring this right underneath the image outline and then duplicate the image matte that we're using to cut a hole inside of the card base. Bring it also on top of the card image tut, hit F4 to toggle the switches, and instead of alpha invert, we're going to do alpha matte. And as you can see, now we have this entire comp contained within the contours of our image matte. Now we do also need to fill out the background here, so we'll go back to the card image tut and we'll bring back the original reference image. Hit Ctrl Y to create a new solid, and then click the eyedropper here and just pick that color of the sky. Hit OK, bring it at the bottom, hit return to rename this to background and shut that off. And now let's go back to the card front tut and just make sure that that is looking all nice. And indeed it is. One more thing is if we keep orbiting like that, you can see that the name text is kind of rendering in weird ways because it is sitting on top of the layer stack. And what we want to do is also make sure we isolate that to the image matte. So let's go ahead and duplicate this one last time, set the alpha matte there. All right, so we're pretty much done with the front side of our card. So let's move on to the back side. To save ourselves some time, we'll select the card front tut, hit Ctrl D to duplicate the comp, and then rename this to card back tut. Double click to open it up, and we'll also just close these for a bit of clarity. Let's start off by right clicking, transform, reset, and you can actually see I set up a shortcut here, which you can do by going over to edit, keyboard shortcuts, and just search for reset transform. So I can actually use Alt R to reset the transform of that camera. And then let's go ahead and delete anything that we don't need, which is pretty much everything except the card base outline. Oh, and we also don't need the alpha matte for that. Now for the back side of the card, what I used was this reference image. There are some minor resemblances, if that's even a word. So let's shut this off and go ahead and start creating those shapes, starting with the circle. So let's double click, go down, ellipse path, and let's set the size to 210 by 210. Let's delete the gradient stroke, bring the fill back up, and then click on the color and just paste the hex code. We'll call this circle and then hit Ctrl D to duplicate, and we'll do circle outline. Go down to the contents. And for this, we do want to have a stroke instead of a fill. So we'll bring that inside, delete the fill. We'll set the stroke width to 10 and then increase the size proportionally to 330. Also make sure that you pick the same color as the circle. For the triangle, we can hit Q to toggle between the different shapes until we have the star shape. Then just make sure you have nothing selected and double click on it. Then go down to the polystar contents under polystar path. We can change the points to 3. Let's also select it, hold down Alt and make sure it's a solid color stroke. Set the stroke width to 40. And we'll also change the color of this to be the same as the background so that it reads when it's inside. I'm thinking the thickness is a bit too much here, so maybe let's say 20. And then we can click and hold down Shift to snap it vertically and just bring it down just a little bit so it's sitting at the center of our circle like that. Let's rename this to triangle, Control A, drop those down. And now let's take a look at the rectangles on the corners, starting with the rectangle tool. So we'll double click on that, then go down to the contents. Under rectangle path, we'll set the size to 25 by 25. And then for the position, we won't use the transform position. Instead, we'll use the position value of the rectangle path, which is going to make it a bit easier to know exactly how many pixels we pushed it to the left side or the right side. So in our case, let's do minus 205 pixels to the left and minus 300 pixels upwards. Let's also go down to the stroke and make sure the stroke width is set to something lower like 4, and then fill it up with this sort of brownish color. Let's also move back up a bit and let's set the roundness to 5 as well, so we don't have those sharp edges. And now all that's left to do is duplicate this 3 more times so we have 1 square per each corner. So we'll do Control D on the rectangle path 2 more times. We'll select one of these, drop them down, and we'll adjust the position to instead go to 205, which will move it across to the right side. And you can see how easy that is by using the position value, which starts at 0, 0 instead of the position value of our layer, which would be a bit more hectic. On the third path, let's leave the X value to minus 205, but set the Y value to 300. And then for the rectangle path 4, we'll do 205 by 300. Now let's also turn these other layers into 3D and start repositioning them in Z space. So we'll hit C, bring up the camera tool and orbit around just a bit so we can see them, and then select all of them, hit P to bring up the position. For the corner squares, I set them to minus 10, and you can see they push a bit forwards. As for the triangle and the circle, we'll do minus 30, and for the circle outline, we'll do minus 20. You can barely notice it, but just gives it a bit more depth. All right, so let's select the camera, Alt-R to reset it. And now finally, we can move on to combining all of these elements. So let's click on this icon here, which creates a new composition, and we'll set it to 1920 by 1080. We'll call it Final Card Combined. Tweet. Leave the other settings as they are and hit OK. We'll start by bringing in both of these comps. And if we were to create a new camera here, hit C and try to orbit around, you can see that nothing happens. And that's because we have the same problem as before, and that is the 3D layers inside of these comps are not taking into account our 3D camera in this comp. So we just need to collapse the transformations and just turn this into 3D. But the other issue that we have now is that they're both rendering on top of each other in sort of weird ways. So you can see the back side of the card here is showing up. And what we want to do is somehow tell the front side of the card to render only when it's facing the camera, but when it's not facing the camera or it's facing away from the camera, we want it to be invisible. And how do we do that? Well, we're gonna use an expression on the opacity value. So let's select the card front tut, hit T to bring up the opacity. And this only works if you have this layer set to a 3D layer. So just make sure you have those ticked. This is very important. And then Alt click on the opacity to add an expression. And I'll quickly copy the expression over from my notepad here, Control V to paste it. And now it's still visible, nothing has happened, but as soon as we go around the card, it's gone. And you can see when I let go, the opacity dropped to 0% there. So we go to the front, we can see it, the opacity is back to 100%. Go to the back, the opacity is down to 0. And again, huge shout out to Ucromedia on YouTube for sharing this very useful expression. Now let's shut off the card front and we'll turn on the card back. And first of all, let's just make sure that we spin this 180 degrees on the y-axis. So we can click here, you can see we're hovering over the gizmo, and then hold down Shift, which will snap it to 45-degree increments, and just go over to 180. So it's facing away from the camera. And then we'll copy the expression here, hit T to bring up the opacity, Alt click and just paste the same expression. Now I do want to point out something real quick. So if we bring the rotation back to what it was originally, normally we would have to make sure we set this one number to -1 instead. So it's not showing when it's facing the camera, but it's showing on the back side. But because we designed the card back tut to face the camera, we do need to make sure that we spin this 180. And as a result, we don't need to change this back to -1. We can keep it at 1 instead. And now we turn both of them back on. And now brace yourselves as we orbit around. Boom! There's our card. Now there is a slight issue here, and that is when we move slowly and just reach the edges here, you can notice the fade in and fade out that's going on. And that's because of this value. So in order to fix that, just make sure this is a 10 instead of 1. And that just makes sure we go right to the edge here and then it just pops in and out instead of fading in and out. Another issue we have is if I go over to this angle right here, we can see the background being cut off there. And that's because back in the card image tut comp, it's not big enough, we just scale it up just a little bit, and that should fill up that area. There you go. Now, besides using the camera, we can actually create a new 3D null, turn that into 3D and call it card controller, and then parent both of these layers to the card controller, hit Ctrl-Shift-H to unhide the UI elements, by the way, and now we hit W to bring up the rotation tool. We can rotate the null and the cards follow along. Now let's go ahead and create a new solid to use as our background, and the color doesn't really matter, so hit OK, and we'll bring it at the bottom. Then we'll search for the gradient ramp effect under the effects and presets panel here, and just drag and drop it into the effects controls. Oops, that's not the right one, gradient ramp. Then we'll set the start color to whatever I have saved here on the side. And same goes for the end color. And then let's just swap the positioning of these two so we have a more brighter bottom there and it goes into a bit of a darker top. Then we'll also search for hue saturation effect. And I am using the effects and presets panel right now just for the sake of the tutorial, but what I usually use is the FX console plugin from Video Copilot, which is a third-party free tool, and it allows you to hit Control Space on a layer and just type in for whatever effect you need and just hit return to add it to the layer. Honestly, I can't really use After Effects without FX Console at this point. So anyway, let's set the saturation to -10 maybe, and the lightness down a bit to -25 or so. Let's add another detail to the background. So with it selected, what we'll do is click and hold the rectangle tool and go over to the ellipse tool. We'll double click on it to make a perfect ellipse, more like a circle there, and we'll bring it down as well. And what we're looking to do is use this mask only on the curves effect. And the way we can do that is by going over to the layer here under effects, curves, there's this compositing options. We can hit the plus icon, and as you can see, we have this icon that popped up on the curves effect, which just means that we're using that mask to isolate the curves effect. And so let's actually brighten this up quite a bit. So we have a more brighter bottom there, and then hit F to bring up the mask feather, and we'll do something like 1000. Using the mask on the effect itself is a much cleaner and faster way because we have one single background layer as opposed to adding, say, a new adjustment layer with a curves effect on it and masking the adjustment layer itself and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Now let's also take a look at how we can add some environment lighting so that our card can reflect it. Let's start by right-clicking New Solid HDRI Environment. Then we'll Control Space and type in CC Environment. And in order for this to work, we need an HDRI image. So we'll go back to the project panel so I can click and drag that into the comp and disable it because we don't need to see it. And then back in the effects controls of our layer, just make sure you pick the basic 2K as the HDRI picture. And now we can use the horizontal pan to look around, maybe even increase the lens distortion so we can see more of the room. Now, in order to make this show up only on top of our cards, instead of, say, using a set matte effect, so for example, we'll do set matte, and let's say choose the card front tut, which will isolate our HDRI to the front side of the card, which of course might look like it's working fine. But remember, as soon as we orbit around, the front side of the card shuts off, and as a result, this will no longer be visible either. So the set matte effect doesn't quite work in this case, so we'll delete it. And by the way, you can see that the CC environment effect does react to our camera, which is pretty nice. But we'll go back to the project panel, and remember all the way at the start, we pre-composed the card base, which is the original shape of the card. And I told you that it's gonna be very important later down the line. Well, this is one of those moments that we're gonna make good use of it. So we'll click and drag it inside of the comp, and we'll rename this to HDRI Matte, turn this into a 3D layer, and also parent it to the card controller, because we do need this to follow the card controller, and then bring it all the way on top of the HDRI environment, hit F4 to toggle the switches, and just set this to alpha matte. And we've pretty much recreated the same thing as we had before with the set matte effect, but this way we won't have to worry about our card shutting off when it faces away from the camera. So let's set this to screen blending mode and then lower the opacity as well to say 25%. We could also add a fast box blur effect to maybe blur it out a bit to something like 20 so it's not as sharp. And then even add a curves effect to dial in the look of our HDRI. Another thing I did was to add this sort of glow around the card. So to do that, what we can do is duplicate the HDRI matte, which is basically the card base. Rename this to, let's say, card glow tight. Then we'll add a fill effect, and we'll give this like a bright blue color or something like that. And we'll bring it right underneath the card sides here. And then we'll add a fast box blur effect to say 20. And then we can also lower down the opacity to say 10% or so. with a screen blending mode. What we can do is duplicate this and rename this to card glow broad and say increase the intensity of this, or actually vice versa. We'll set this to like 25 or something. So we have a tighter glow, which is a bit more intense. And then for this broad one, we can increase the blur to say 100 and maybe even increase the iteration. So it's a bit of a smoother glow. Same goes for the card glow tight. So without, with. Another thing I did with the original version was to have a light in our scene and have that light hit the card, and then the card would cast shadows on this ground layer, which is pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and create a new light. We'll do point light, cast shadows on, and then we'll worry about the shadow darkness and diffusion in a moment. So hit OK. And as soon as I added that, you may have noticed a shift in the brightness and colors of our card. And that's because we do have these set as 3D layers, and they are accepting lights by default. So what we want to do is make sure that all of the layers that we have created up until now are set to not accept any lights. So we'll go over to the card front comp here, and we'll select the top layer, hold down Shift, select the bottom one, which will select everything in between. Hit A twice, so AA, which will bring up the material options, and then set the cast shadows to off and the accept lights to off as well. Do the same thing in the card back tut, so select all of them, AA, accept shadows to off, and accept lights to off. Same thing for the dragon, but as you can see, if we hit AA, these are already set to off because we did copy them from the original comp. Oh, and also for good measure, select the card glows and also set those to off for both accept shadows and accept lights. Now, as you can see, when I turn the light on and off, there is no difference. Now let's go ahead and create the ground layer. So we'll go layer, new solid, and we'll call this ground. And again, the color doesn't matter because what we're gonna do is turn this into a 3D layer. With the ground selected, you can hover over the X axis here, click on it and hold down Shift to snap it to 45-degree increments and go over to -90. Then hit V, bring it down onto the floor here. Oh, and also make sure it's right below the cards. Lower it down just a little bit. Then we'll hit S, scale this up to 1000 so it covers the entire area. And finally hit AA and set the accept shadows to only. But we can't quite see a shadow right now because nothing is casting shadows. And again, to make good use of our card base comp, we'll bring it in, we'll rename this to card shadow caster, turn this into 3D, parent it to the card controller, and then hit AA on this. And for this, we want to cast shadows only. So we don't see the card itself, but we only see the shadow that it's casting on the ground. Now we can go ahead and tweak the light here, position and intensity of the shadows as well. We hit AA, set the shadow darkness to something like 40 maybe, and the shadow diffusion to 250. So I have this soft looking shadow. Now let's add a new adjustment layer for some extra color correction. So we'll rename this to CC for color correction. Control space, we'll do curves. And we'll first of all add just a bit of contrast like so, make things pop a bit more. Then we'll add hue saturation, we'll boost the saturation a bit. And then also some noise, which I mentioned earlier, we'll do something like 4%. We can also switch to full resolution so we can see this. It's full glory. Now let's duplicate the adjustment layer. And what we can do is select all of the effects here and delete them. Or let's Control Z. There's a shortcut for deleting all the effects on a certain layer, which is Control Shift E. And then we'll rename this to glow, and we'll put this right underneath there. And we'll add the glow effect. Now we do have to be careful with this because we don't want to overdo it. So let's start off by setting the glow intensity to 0.1. So it's very subtle. Then we'll decrease the threshold until it grabs a bit more of the area here. So up until, let's say, 30. And then also the glow radius to 5%. So it's a very tight glow. And usually with glow effects, what I like to do is duplicate this 2 more times. So I end up with 3 glow effects, each of them being a bit broader. So for this one, we'll do radius 50. And we'll also increase the threshold so it doesn't grab as much of the picture. And then one last time, we'll duplicate this, set the radius this time to 100%, so it's a very broad, soft glow. As I zoomed out here, you may notice this issue, which we can see due to the ground layer. And to be honest, I don't really know why this happens. It looks as if the glow is bleeding onto the edges of our ground into the background. So a quick and dirty fix I found was to just select the background, hit S, and then just scale it up. Again, this might not be an ideal fix to this issue, which I don't even know why it occurs. But if you do happen to know, then please leave a comment down below and I will be forever grateful. Going back to the background here, I'm thinking maybe we brighten up that bottom part just a little bit more. Also, let's select the glow, hit T, bring up the opacity and set it to 50% so it's even more subtle. Then we'll duplicate this, hit Ctrl Shift E to delete all of the effects, and we'll call this cross blur. bring it below, and what we're looking to do is add some diagonal streaky glow lines. So to achieve that, we'll add the CC cross blur effect, and what this effect does is basically the same as, say, adding a fast box blur and making the blur dimensions to horizontal and just increasing the blur radius. So if you turn this off, increase the radius X, it's pretty much the same effect. We'll set the X and Y to 50%, and depending on the intensity, you may want to change the blending mode. But before we do any of that, I just want to show you something real quick. So you may notice that we only have vertical and horizontal blurry lines. Well, how do we make these diagonal? To achieve that, we're going to use what is called a transform sandwich. And to do that, we'll add the transform effect. We'll bring it above the cross blur so it renders before it. Then we'll set the rotation to 45 degrees, which essentially rotates the entire image. And right now we have this set to 50%, so it's not affecting everything properly. But if we set it to 100%, there you go. And now what's happening is we're rotating the image, we're blurring it horizontally and vertically, and then we can duplicate the transform effect and put it below the cross blur, and this time we'll set it to -45, essentially canceling the rotation. And if we were to not have anything in between these two effects, basically they cancel each other out. But seeing as we do have the cross blur effect, which happens after the first transform effect, we end up with these diagonal streaky lines. Let's go ahead and set this back to screen mode, and we'll even set the opacity down to 20%, so it's very subtle, and we can barely make them out if we zoom in here. But again, name of the game is subtlety. With all of that set up, we can now focus a bit on the animation part. So let's select the card controller. And what I want to do is have this scale up from the bottom point and also rotate around. Now, seeing as the anchor point is at the center here, when we hit S and scale this down, it's going to center from that point. So let's go ahead and hit A to bring up the anchor point, and we'll adjust the Y value here to go to 350, which is half of 700, which is the original vertical size of our card. Then we can hit P, and on the Y value of our position, we can just add 350 to that. And that just brings us back to where we were before. After Effects can actually do math on these values, so keep that in mind. And now when we hit S, we can scale it right there from the bottom. And let's just set this to 0. We might get some errors, but just ignore those. We can actually set this to 0.1, because for some reason, when you set things to 0%, they tend to break. But anyway, we'll set a keyframe there, and we'll move over to, say, 2 seconds, and we'll set this back to 100%. In fact, we'll do 110, so it overshoots a bit. And then let's say go back to 4 seconds, and we'll go over to 100%. Now we can select these two, hit F9 to easy ease them, and then we can also go over to the graph editor, and we'll select the scale value. And what we'll do is just make sure that we bring the handles here a bit further so we have a more interesting animation. So we can stretch this out a bit. Essentially what we're looking for is to have this come in very quickly. So scale up very quickly, hang in there for a little bit, and then also scale down like so. So if you give that a quick preview, let's maybe push this to 1 second, bring this over. We basically want this to scale up very quickly and then slowly come back to its original scale. Now we can go out of the graph editor, hold down Shift and hit R to bring up the rotation values while also keeping the scale value. And what we want to do is animate the Y rotation. So we'll set a keyframe here, move over a bit, and let's say spin this card for 2 times. And let's just put the end keyframe to 4 seconds, and we'll bring this over here. We'll hit F9 on the last keyframes and then go back to the graph editor. We'll grab this, bring it all the way over. And in fact, I want to also hit F9 on this and just grab the handle here and just make sure we lay it flat. When we start, it's already spinning very quickly. Another thing we could animate is the camera itself. And usually what I like to do is create a null, turn that into 3D, call it camera control, and then parent the camera to the null itself. And this way we can actually animate the camera control null instead of the camera, which can be a bit tedious sometimes. So we'll hit R, and then we'll set a keyframe for both the X and Y rotations. And let's say tilt this up a bit to maybe 10 degrees, and then maybe -10 on the Y, like so. So we have this cool, interesting angle. And then right at the start, we could maybe do the other way around. So we'll do -10 and 10. And then we can bring these all the way at the start. And we'll actually pull this all the way to 6 seconds. So even after the card controller null finishes its animation, we still have a bit of movement from the camera itself. So let's hit F9, bring up the graph editor, and with both of those selected, just bring them in just like so. We could also animate the light position to change the shadow direction. So let's hit P on the point light, set a keyframe for the position, and let's say it's at this point all the way at the end here, but at the beginning, we can maybe move it to the other side. So click and hold on the X value, and then hold down Shift to go a bit faster on it. And then we'll move this over as this is moving or as this is playing. You can see the shadow changes as well. And then hit F9 on that to easy ease it. And to make this motion look a bit nicer, what we could do is enable motion blur for all of our layers here. So let's just select the card shadow caster, card glows, turn on motion blur for those. Then we can go inside of the original comps as well. We can select all of these, turn on motion blur for those as well. Do the same thing here and do the same thing over here, which we already have apparently. And now once we turn the motion blur in the main comp, we can see if we zoom in as the movement is happening, we get some motion blur. Finally, let's add one last detail, which is the light sweep that you see across the card. And that's actually a pretty simple effect. All we have to do is just select the card front side. We'll go over to the effects controls. Let's control space, add CC light sweep. And there you go, we have a light sweep. Let's shut off the motion blur so we can work faster while we animate the center value. Let's set a keyframe, hit U to bring up the keyframes. Find a spot here where we can animate this in. So as soon as we see the front side, we can maybe have this start to come in. Let's just move the light sweep across to this side and then across, let's say 2 seconds or so, we can have it on the other side. F9 that. Alright guys, so as far as the animation, the design, the look and everything goes, we've pretty much covered everything. So let's take a look at how we can make good use of the essential graphics tools to make it very easy on ourselves to make a copy of the card and change the info on the card, change the image as well, and make all of those adjustments very easy to do. Let's start by going back to the original card front TUT comp. Then we'll go over to Window, Essential Graphics, and this is the original card front comp, so we'll switch over to what we have right now, which is card front TUT. And right now it's empty, so we don't have any values assigned here. And essentially what we have to do is just go over to, say, the name, drop this down under text, and grab the source text, and just click and drag that into the essential graphics. If we just click on that and say, change this, you'll see that updating. And now we can continue doing the same thing for all the other layers. Once we have everything set up, we actually have some more options here. So for example, for the name, let's say we want to make it so that the user can change the font size and the font itself. So we'll enable those options, and now we can see the font that was used, the style of the font, and even the size. So we could maybe say set this to bold instead. We could maybe give this card 8 health and change pretty much anything that we put in here. Now, how is this useful? Well, if we go back to the final card combined TUT comp, and let's say even close the essential graphics panel, you can see we now have this essential properties drop-down list. And if we click on the drop-down arrow, we have all of those values that we can control from here. All we have to do is right-click on it, go to edit value, and now change the name to something else and hit OK, and that will automatically update in this comp. And the beauty of this is, even if we say right-click, reveal composition in project, and let's say duplicate this, and we'll go inside of this duplicated comp, you might think that because we're using the same pre-comps and everything, if we change the name of this to say something else, hit OK, that the card name will be else in the previous comp that we had as well. But that's not the case. You can see it's still change. You have else, change, else, change. And that's why the Essential Graphics tool is so powerful in this case, because we can basically use the same pre-comps that we have set up, which is like, what, 4 or 5 pre-comps, and not have to worry about duplicating those pre-comps and then replacing them in multiple comps just to change the name and create multiple cards. In fact, let's just delete this and go back to the original comp we had. We can make copies of this card inside of the same comp. So let's just say select all the layers that we need. So all of these, the HDRI as well, and then hit Control D to duplicate them. And I will select the card controller 2, and we'll bring this over to the side. Maybe select the card controller 1. I am breaking the animation though, so yeah, anyway, it doesn't matter. And now let's say go into one of these cards under the essential properties. Let's say change the attack value to 20. Oops. That's 2p, too much. Okay, and there you go. Now this copy has attack of 20 and this one has attack of 10. Now, what about the card image itself? How can we go about duplicating this so that we have a different card image on a different copy of the card? Well, let's right click on the card image, go reveal layer source in project, and let's duplicate this. And let's say this becomes a red dragon instead. And we'll double click to open it up. And let's quickly just delete all of these mountains and we'll adjust the color of this to something like a dark red. And select the dragon and set this to, I don't know, bright red. Now back in the card front TUT, we'll go over to the project panel. Let's duplicate this. So we have a duplicate of the card image. And then hold down Alt as you click and drag this to swap those two comps. And now we have a red dragon image. And now we'll bring back the essential graphics and we'll select both of these card images, hit T to bring up the opacity, and we'll add the opacity value into the essential graphics, and we'll do red dragon, normal dragon. We could even add a group here and then just bring these both into the group. And you can probably guess now, if we go back to the original comp, what we can do is one more time, let's duplicate these and we'll bring one of them over one more time. Over here, you can also see the cards. In fact, you can even rename this to card images. And let's say for this one, I want to actually see the red dragon. So we'll set this to 100% and the normal dragon to 0%. And now I have very quickly created two different cards. And all we had to do is duplicate the card image TUT, make adjustments to the new duplicate, add that to the card front, add those opacity values into the essential graphics, and we're all set and ready to go to make whatever adjustments we need in the main comp. Alright guys, so that's pretty much it as far as the 3D cards are concerned. If it was a bit too hard to follow, just make sure to rewind back, maybe even use the speed options in YouTube to slow it down so you can watch through the tutorial in a bit of a slower speed. And with that said, let's move on to the outro of this video. Alright guys, thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Again, I challenge you to recreate a 3D card from your favorite strategy card game by using techniques you've learned in this tutorial. And if you do happen to post it on social media platforms, then don't forget to also tag me. Remember to download the project files on my Gumroad page, which are using the pay what you want system, so you can grab anything you want for free, while still having the option to support the channel if you'd like to. If you don't want to miss out on upcoming videos, then make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell to be notified. Thank you once again for watching, and may the heart of the cards be with you. Peace out.